Hi there! I've come across a request from one of my dear viewers to render the likeness of Khalshul, the Gullmaster of the old Rust Coast, which I will be happy to dive into in just a moment. If you haven't seen my content before, this series is a world-building project for a fantasy world ruled by goblins, called Gobberland. It's created by names that viewers leave in the comments section of my videos. From those names, I create a character design as well as some lore around the character, usually in the form of a few paragraphs or of a story tying them all into the same universe. For several years now, I've been building this world on TikTok, but recently I've started making long-form content on YouTube. In order to help me get my footing on here, I would really appreciate it if you could like, subscribe, or maybe even comment a name for another character for a video. Beginning this design, I have a very clear concept in my mind. An old bearded goblin perched on a rock, surrounded by a great horde of seagulls and a massive swirling cloud that he controls in some way. A kind of sage figure, a little bit funky and unhinged, with the focus of the piece being the sheer amount of seagulls. However, even with this very clear mental image, I'm struggling a little to actually show it. I want him to be in this funny little pointing pose, contorted in some odd way, perhaps insinuating this is part of some ritual dance. To help me with this, I used a website called justsketch.me, which I used to create this pose here. I'm not sponsored or anything, of course, it was just useful, so I figured I'd mention it. Honestly, I'm a big proponent of using whatever kind of reference you can get as an artist. I know a lot of younger artists look down on references as a form of cheating, and that you should be able to create a drawing directly from your imagination. I know this because I used to believe this as well. But references often really just are the best way to achieve a realistic design. Most professional concept artists and character designers use references in their work, so I see no reason for others to avoid using them as well. This pose with a little adjustment actually ends up working really well, and I'm starting to really enjoy where this design is going. I've got a bunch of fun little details hidden in there for y'all. Like, for example, how instead of his beard connecting to his sideburns, it actually connects with his ear hair. I also gave him a bunch of feathers sticking out of his arms like wings. I imagine that these didn't grow naturally, but rather, in order to be more bird-like, he takes the shed feathers of his seagull wards and sticks them in his own arm flesh. He also has no clothing except for a long hat flowing in the wind, and of course his long beard. All of this gives him a very wild and feral vibe, a concept which I love for this guy. Perhaps he was separated from his family as a child, or a goblin, to use the in-universe term, and was raised by seagulls. Maybe they view him as one of their own, a particularly long-lived and wise seagull, whose orders they follow because he finds sources of food for them by ordering them to attack and sink ships, or perhaps even for more mystical reasons. Regardless, I think it's about time to get into the most difficult part of this piece, the gulls themselves. I want them to be relatively simple and easy for me to draw, seeing as I will be drawing hundreds of these guys, but I also want them to have a bit of that Gobberland vibe. I ended up giving them beady red eyes and these funny little arms. These arms on birds are a motif I've actually used in the past for some of my other artwork, such as this piece, which was selected as the cover for the 2025 issue of Read Literary Magazine. It just adds a bit of a surreal flair to designs that I think is really fun. As a smaller detail, I also gave them some tiny little claws on their wings, similar to a bat's thumb claw. Some real-life bird species do actually have wing claws, most prominently on the Konradsen, a tropical bird species native to South America. Konradsen chicks actually use them to climb on vegetation in dense rainforests in order to escape from predators. Some other bird species also have wing claws, such as chickens, though these usually aren't functional and are much smaller. The wing claw is actually a trait that originates from the ancestors of modern birds, which were dinosaurs, and more specifically, theropods, as the structure of the wing itself had evolved from a clawed forelimb. Technically speaking, birds are still considered dinosaurs, which means that the dinosaurs never went extinct, well, except for the non-avian ones. I imagine that these Gobberland gulls might make good use of their wing claws when climbing the sheer cliffs of the old Rust Coast, something that their own little arms would also probably help with. These arms do admittedly throw a little wrench into the evolutionary workings of this world, meaning that the natural history of Goberland and these gulls didn't follow the conventional tetrapodal or four-limbed evolutionary scheme that we see in our world. Perhaps their common ancestor with goblins is further back in the evolutionary tree than our own common ancestor with real-life birds. Or perhaps, as we've seen elsewhere in Goberland, the workings of evolution simply occur at a different pace, and to more severe and surreal results than our world. Or perhaps they encountered some type of magical influence, generations back, mutating their forms into this unnatural shape. Maybe even this is what allows Khalshul to communicate with them. With that underway, here's a good stage, I think, to start work on the scenery. The Old Rust Coast is a very clear-cut name, one that I think paints a clear picture. I imagine that perhaps the region has a lot of iron deposits, so much so that the rocks are colored red by the iron oxidizing and turning into rust. I would also like to combine this imagery with the coast of the American Pacific Northwest, as I want the scene to look dreary and abandoned. Huge, sheer cliffs, thick mists that permit no sunlight, dangerous rocks dotting the water with dark waves crashing white against them. Because of how the scene is turning out, though, I'll need to place the cliffs at a distance from the viewer, which will unfortunately cause their red color to be obscured by the fog. I think this is a worthy trade-off, as the atmosphere created by this is invaluable to the scene. I also like how it looks like Khalshul is just standing on this random rock a good distance from the shore, with no indication as to how he got there. Did he swim through all that cold water just to get here, or is he somehow able to fly, either with the help of his seagull friends or with the feathers he sticks in his arms? Creating these visual mysteries are key to designing an interesting composition. The longer you, as an artist, can convince a viewer to look at a piece, the more successful the piece is generally considered. As a final little detail, I'm covering all these rocks with guano, which is the term used for the accumulated excrement of specifically seabirds and bats. If you spend any time along the coast, you've likely seen large offshore rocks that appear white. More often than not, that's not the rock's actual color, but just the accumulation of decades and sometimes centuries worth of seagull poop. And with that, we've reached the end of this design, which means that we may now, at long last, hear the story of Khalshul, the Gullmaster of the Old Rust Coast. The legion cries of the Gullmaster's feathered host echo through these rusted bluffs, bounteous guano staining red rock white in great streaking, stinking layers. Khalshul, his name salt-cursed by sailors sea-wide, reigns as a tyrant reaver king over the entire stretch of the now deserted Old Rust Coast. The region was once prosperous. Plentiful mines dotted the land, small villages growing outwards from them like rot around a wound. A prosperous harbor or two funneled iron, fish, and wealth out of the territory. Though the harsh weather kept the area from becoming too metropolitan, the Old Rust Coast was growing to be an economical boon to the rest of Goberland. That is, until the Gullmaster Khalshul took power. It is unknown where he came from, and only few have had the misfortune of sighting him. Refugees tell fanciful stories that as a goblin he was thrown from a cliff by his parents. Suffering under the oppressive hand of the region's growing industry, they had misguidedly sought a blessing of the spirit of the sea for liberation, offering up the young Khalshul as a sacrifice. By some miracle he survived the great fall, and was raised by the great flocks of gulls that nested on the cliffs. He forgot his mother tongue, learning the screeching speech of his avian kin, remembering only an intense hatred towards all gobkind. 12 years after his loss, in the hours of the early morning, great clouds of seabirds rose from the mists above the waters, and in a shrieking, cacophonous fury, descended upon the villages of the Old Rust Coast. Yellow beaks tore at screaming meat, small talons gouging and grasping. The survivors of the attack whisper rumors that within the swirling, spinning horde of feathers and bird flesh, at the very center, soared a child. Like some spirit of vengeance, of liberation, he stood high in the air, gulls holding him aloft. His gaze condemned, and his voice, high and piercing, commanded death. To this day none dare to resettle the old Rust Coast. Any ships that are swept too close to those cursed shores are beset upon by a swarm of gulls who rip at sail and skin, too numerous to fight, too fast to flee. A figure is sometimes seen in the distance, dancing atop a pillar of stone jutting from the water, nude in spite of the frigid weather and sea spray, squawking like a bird. Thanks for watching. If you'd like to support me doing these videos, I'd appreciate it if you could drop a like and a follow. Since my last video, I also passed 10,000 subscribers. Thank you guys so much. I'm eternally grateful to have found such a large and dedicated community interested in this little world that I'm building. This also put me past the milestone to be able to monetize my videos, so if you'd like to help me out, maybe consider watching my Gobberland playlist on loop while you sleep. If you'd like to support me more directly, I'd be quite grateful if you could throw me a few bucks on my store or on my Patreon. The links for both will be in the description below. Thank you so much.